work in my mind. I didn't understand why I would be feeding a diabetic a nutrient that they can't metabolize very well, and that required they take more medication. And I thought I didn't understand it right, and so I went back to graduate school to try to learn more about metabolism and nutrition. And around the same time, and I don't recall the exact reason, but I decided myself to switch from a very low-fat to a ketogenic diet, just to experiment with it, see how I responded. And it was, nothing short of an epiphany and very transformative in the way I responded to the diet. And that reinforced my drive to want to understand ketosis even more in graduate school. And so I was obsessed really with learning as much as I could about ketosis. And this is again mid-90s. Luckily for me, there wasn't a whole lot of literature on ketosis at that time. At least if you look throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was hardly anything published on ketogenic diets. You had to go back into the 60s and earlier, and there were a lot of really very smart researchers pursuing ketogenic diets, especially in the area of obesity, with the one notable exception being epilepsy, where we've had a lot of literature in that area going back even 100 years. We have evidence of that being used as a therapy. But nonetheless, I was able to convince my advisor to let me do my doctoral dissertation on a ketogenic diet. The results were positive. And subsequently, I've done, dozens of prospective diet interventions on ketogenic diets. And I like to tell people, I'm not on some crusade to prove ketosis is the perfect metabolic state to be in, even though it is. But I'm a scientist, and so I'm data-driven. And the reason I pursued ketosis and the reason I'm up on the stage talking about the benefits of ketosis is because that's what the data have shown me. And it's always been positive and reinforcing and opened up new questions that I've wanted to address. So that's why I've studied ketosis for, what's going on the better part of 2 decades now. And most of my work has been more clinically oriented in the areas of obesity and prediabetes and diabetes. And that's spanned over into other areas, more recently into performance, because I've always been interested in enhancing physical capabilities and sports performance. So that's what I'm going to focus the majority of my talk on today. And thankfully, Dom and Jake covered a lot of great material, so I can go through some of my stuff pretty quickly. So what's the trick here to advance? Point it that way. Is it the arrow button? Okay.
Put some keto on it.
Yeah.
Ketones.
Going left and right.
Around the tongue.
There it is.
There we go. So the major objective of my talk today is going to be to convince you that high carbohydrate intake is not required or an obligate part of a healthy diet. I don't think that's going to take too long for this group. But to say that athletes can actually perform without carbs, that's really provocative. That's really heretical in many ways, because we've been told for decades that athletes have to have carbs to perform well and recover. And there's been a whole multi-billion-dollar industry built around that's constantly reinforced that idea. And so the other objective would be to convince you that athletes can abandon their high-carb diets and get into ketosis and not just perform, but actually perform at an extremely high level. In some cases, even win races, set records, set world records. But let me give you a little additional background on the history sort of diet. We've had our dietary guidelines in this country. That the first guidelines were published in 1980, and it's really been it's been fairly consistent. We've had pretty much the same guidelines over that almost 4-decade period, and it's focused on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate approach. And I have been very active recently, especially the last year, more on an advocacy level. I've been to Capitol Hill about 5 times in the last year and a half, lobbying to congressmen, trying to change the guidelines because they're really, in my mind, contributing to many of the chronic problems we have in this country. And to show you that, I mean, it's not news to you that we have an obesity and diabetes epidemic, but if you really look at the numbers here, I don't know if you've actually paid attention to the statistics. It is staggering, folks. Almost 3 out of 4 adults in this country are overweight or obese. And more even concerning than that is that this has occurred while we're eating less saturated fat. And that's been the cornerstone of our guidelines, that saturated fat is the villain, it's malign, it's the cause of all our health problems. And so it's interesting that this obesity diabetes epidemic has occurred while adults in the U.S. have actually reduced their saturated fat intake. What they've done is replace it with a whole bunch more carbohydrate, including a lot of simple sugars and processed carbohydrate. But the average person now is overweight. And what's more concerning, this is a paper published in the Journal of American Medical Association just last year on the most recent statistics on diabetes. And a staggering 50% of adults in the U.S. are pre-diabetic. So imagine that. I mean, the average person now is pre-diabetic. So they have some underlying insulin resistance or breakdown in their insulin response system. About 15% of the population, or 35 million or so Americans, have diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And this is not unique to the U.S., folks. This is a global problem. Every continent, every developed country is suffering from the same problem. Japan, China. China has over 100 million people with type 2 diabetes. They have about the same prevalence as we do, but given their larger denominator. And India is right up there too. Middle East, huge problem. Their prevalence is even higher than the U.S. So, this is not unique to us, but we clearly have, a pandemic here, a global problem with diabetes. And to be quite frank, a ketogenic diet is nothing short of a miracle for managing and even reversing diabetes. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but that is really exciting because we can really start to move the needle and change the direction of these statistics. So we already heard a lot about some of the practical aspects. I wanted to lead off, maybe add a little bit more dimension to what a ketogenic diet is, because there is a lot of misconception out there. So there's a lot of popular diets. We throw the word around low carbohydrate diet. What does that mean, though? Well, the truth is there's no formal or accepted definition of that, but let's just say arbitrarily a low-carb diet is less than 30% carbohydrate based on energy expenditure. So you've got several types of low-carb diets that are promoted. Paleo certainly has gotten a lot of traction in the last few years, but paleo, at least traditional paleo that I think of, is not a ketogenic diet. It's lower in carbohydrate, yes, it does have a lot of, people experience a lot of benefit from it because they're getting rid of a lot of sugars and processed starches in their diet. But it's not ketogenic, mainly because it's probably a little too high in carbs, but it's also too high in protein. So a ketogenic diet is restricted in carbs, but it's also somewhat constrained in protein as well. Protein is anti-ketogenic. So it's not a high-protein diet. It's not a low-protein diet either. It's what I would call an adequate protein diet. So it's got enough protein to maintain and even have a positive nitrogen balance to build muscle. But by definition, it does have to be somewhat limited in protein. And the carbs have to be, this varies from person to person, but the carbs need to be below, on average, about 50 grams a day. But for some type 2 diabetics who are very insulin resistant, they may need to restrict to 30 grams per day in order to enter into nutritional ketosis. There are some very healthy insulin sensitive athletes putting in a lot of mileage, that can eat 70, 80 grams of carbs, maybe more per day, and still be in ketosis. So it's something that varies from person to person, and it's also why we really encourage people to measure the ketones so they know, and can use that to tweak their diet. And you've already heard from previous speakers that this diet's not burdensome, but I have to say that's still, even amongst the academics and the medical healthcare professionals that I talk with that really do understand the science and accept it, still have struggle with the fact that they think no one can stay on this diet, that it's too restrictive. And I would argue just the opposite. I mean, this diet's not only palatable, and you can include such variety in it, even at the strictest levels of carbs, it's actually pleasurable. It's very enjoyable to eat in this way, and we've done a lot of prospective studies, free living, and more recently we do primarily feeding studies where we provide all the food, and people love it. And they prefer it over high-carb diets because of all the perceived benefits. So this is eminently doable by people. Having said that, the other side of the coin is that I don't want to trivialize it either. It's not really easy to follow this lifestyle if you haven't gone through some education and understand some principles of what a well-formulated ketogenic diet is. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but I'll mention a few things here. So a ketogenic diet, when you look at the macronutrient distribution, is a very high-fat diet based on energy expenditure. And it's limited in protein. So usually at 50 grams of carbs, that's about 5% of your energy intake. And, to add up to 40, 50 grams of carbs, this is usually how it breaks down for folks that are eating a variety of foods. I mean, just from the meats and protein-based foods, you're going to get some carbs with that, 5 to 10 grams. You're going to, vegetables are highly encouraged on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, but the non-starchy ones. So that, you get another 10, 15 grams of carbs. Nuts and seeds are great. You can even have some very high water content fruits like berries and avocados and olives are botanically fruits. They can fit in low amounts. So right there, that's where your food comes from. There's no room here for bread, for pasta, for cereals, really. But given all this and all the fat-containing foods, I guess I'm done. Thank you very much. I might have hit the wrong button there. So you can eat a lot of delicious foods that on normal diets that restrict fat are taboo, like butter and cream and high-fat dairy and cheese. And I'm, having followed this diet for nearly 2 decades, I'm still discovering new recipes and ways to be creative in the kitchen. So even the most creative kind of cooks and culinary people out there, there's a lot you can do with a ketogenic diet. So ketosis. Again, you've heard a lot about ketosis already, so I'm not going to be too redundant. But realize that ketosis is still it's a malign word, and it's still the connotation with most healthcare professionals is you can read this in textbooks that ketones are toxic byproducts of fat metabolism. And this is what's taught to dietitians, to physicians, to nurses, to all our healthcare professionals. So this is what we're doing now, is we're really changing this paradigm of ketosis. And it's unfortunate. Part of this goes back to the discovery of ketones in the urine of uncontrolled type 1 diabetics, which is a really serious problem when they're in ketoacidosis, right? And so that negative connotation of ketones in type 1 diabetics has kind of stuck, despite the fact that ketoacidosis is something we don't have to worry about for everyone, with a minor exception of type 1 diabetics who don't produce insulin. So unless you're insulin insufficient, you never enter into ketoacidosis. And that's what I kind of wanted to show here, the different levels of ketones. This is really important to understand. everyone's producing ketones, even if you're eating carbohydrate. It's just at a very low level on a normal moderate to high carbohydrate diet. And also realize ketones are ancient metabolites. I mean, this is how Homo sapiens evolved. It's why we have big brains. I mean, ketosis and ketogenesis and ketoadaptation were critical during the evolutionary process. It allowed us to fuel our brains when we didn't have access to food over long periods of time. So ketosis is perfectly natural. That's my main point. And in almost all people, that metabolic program to produce ketones is perfectly intact. Even in type 2 diabetics who might have a very high genetic propensity for diabetes, they have a perfectly normal capacity to produce ketones. It's just that in most of us that are eating carbs, we're suppressing that ability to produce ketones at a high level. So that's almost like a software program that's just dormant. And the only way that we fire it up is to restrict carbs, or now we have Keto OS to also augment ketosis and experience what it's like to be in a state of ketosis. And the vast majority of people don't have any idea what that's like because they've been eating carbs since day one that they were born. But to give you a sense of the levels here, so if you're normally eating carbohydrate, your levels, you're still producing them, but they're very low, 0.1, 0.2 millimolar. After a very low carbohydrate diet, levels go up in order of magnitude. So from 0.1 to 1 millimolar, or anywhere up to 3 or 4 millimolar is possible with a very low carb diet. So that's a huge increase, a more than tenfold increase. But it's still a tenfold lower level than what you see in ketoacidosis, where levels often get up to above 20 millimolar. And again, that never happens unless you're insulin insufficient. We have classic, negative feedback systems in place that prevent that from happening. And so, I like to say, very low ketones is probably not good. It's like, it's like a drought. Moderate ketosis, nutritional ketosis, is great. You need to have rain to grow the crops and make everything nice and green. But you don't need a tsunami. That's what ketoacidosis is. So you need to, ketones in this normal range is where we function optimally. And Dom showed you this slide. Most of us are below 0.5 millimolar, which is where I would say nutritional ketosis kind of starts, where we start to see the benefits. And that extends up to the 3, 4, maybe 5 millimolar range. And it's only when you get way out into ketoacidosis where you run into life-threatening situations, but that's not a concern. And we've also talked about, the main function of ketones as we classically understand ketosis is to provide an alternative fuel for the brain. And I think you all appreciate that. But you may not have appreciated how metabolically active the brain is. I mean, it's pretty small, considering our total body mass. The brain only occupies a pretty small fraction. But metabolically, about a quarter or a third of our energy expenditure is accounted for by the brain. So an average brain burns about 600 kilocalories per day. And normally that's being met by glucose. So that's 150 grams of glucose required to fuel the brain. And it doesn't like to have any interruption in fuel supply. And that's what happens when you eat a high carb lunch and then an hour later your head's on the table, right? That's because you've got an insulin response and you drove the blood sugar into the cells and you've got a rebound hypoglycemia, and that's an interruption in the blood glucose supply to the brain. So being keto adapted, though, and this goes back to the classic work George Cahill, as Dom mentioned, performed back in the 60s, showing that over 2/3 of the energy in the brain can be supplied by ketones. And that's a much more stable, sustainable fuel source because the ketones are coming from your fat cells. And you've got most of us have well over 40,000 kilocalories worth of fat that we can use to make ketones and to use as fuel. So the other perspective, and again, this has been alluded to with previous speakers, so we knew about all that. You know, we've known for over 40 years that the brain can use ketones and that it can provide an alternative fuel source to glucose. But what's much newer and super exciting and opens up all sorts of new possibilities with ketones is this recognition that it's more than a metabolite, as the name of this recent review paper suggests. So there was a paper published in Science, pretty high-level journal to get published in, by a group that really laid out an elegant series of experiments showing that the primary ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate, was a potent signaling molecule. And Dom alluded to this right at the end of his talk, that ketones are having epigenetic effects, and specifically they're potent histone deacetylase inhibitors. And that's a mouthful, but that's one of the most common ways in which we alter gene expression. And that's what they showed in this particular paper, was that beta-hydroxybutyrate altered gene expression. In particular, it upregulated a whole group of antioxidant genes that protect against oxidative stress. And so this fits with a lot of the clinical data that we've seen over the years with the ketogenic diet being associated with less oxidative stress. Now we have a precise mechanism by which it may be doing that through these signaling effects. We also know that there's receptors on cells that identify beta-hydroxybutyrate, and many of the pathways and signaling systems that are activated are the same signaling pathways that we've identified with longevity and pathways that contribute to cancer are downregulated. So there's this whole new perspective that ketones are not just alternative fuel. That's one really important feature, but they're having a whole range of signaling effects that are promoting health. And that's sort of a dual mechanism by which they're promoting better health for folks. So my general view of health and wellness and preventing disease kind of comes back to a metabolic type of, that's the lens I view it through. And when you think about it from a metabolic perspective, we can either burn carbs or we can burn fat. And more when you look at the literature, I mean, it's pretty clear. The body prefers to burn fat more than carbs. So anytime we can switch a cell over to burning a greater amount of fat relative to carbs, that's generally associated with good health. And so that's one point. The other point is, how do we do that? How do we increase our fat burning? And you can exercise, you can take thermogenic supplements and stimulants, and those work to some extent, but they pale in comparison to what you can achieve when you restrict carbohydrate. That's by far the most robust stimulus to shift a cell over to burning fat. Some of it's kind of intuitive. You take away the carbs, the body's left with burning fat. But it's really profound. When you restrict carbs, the ability to oxidize fat increases dramatically. And there's a whole set of well-coordinated adaptations that occur to maintain proper inter-organ fuel exchange. And that's really what keto adaptation is. It's that entire process of switching over to fat fuels, which include fatty acids and ketones, really. And that does everything from reverse type 2 diabetes and help obese people lose weight to potentially even enhancing and optimizing peak performance. And so on the clinical side, I won't spend much time here because you've heard a lot about the clinical benefits of ketogenic diets. But really, there's an enormous interest across many different disciplines in ketogenic diets and a range of different diseases. My interest is really diabetes because that's what we've studied and that's such a huge problem. And it's absolutely remarkable. I'm involved now with a very large clinical trial with almost 400 type 2 diabetics, 2-year study to show that people can actually stay on these diets. And I can't share with you all the results. I'll just say after just 70 days, over half the diabetic patients have normalized their hemoglobin A1C and reversed their type 2 diabetes. And that's very incredible, because the traditional thinking is that we may be able to slow the disease down, but we can't reverse it. But the truth is the spontaneous remission of type 2 diabetes is like 0.1%. So the other really important and fascinating piece of that is we're doing that while we're getting people off medication. So 100% of the patients are reducing their insulin dose. Over half of them have gotten completely off insulin. And it's happened while they're losing substantial amounts of weight. So the normal course to manage glucose in diabetics is to give them more meds, and those medications cause them to gain weight.
Right.
And we know that that's not benign. So this is really powerful for diabetes. But as you've heard too, it's going to, I think, turn out to be quite helpful for many types of cancer. You'll hear from Dr. Hoff and next, as well as many neurological conditions. I mean, it's almost too good to be true. You really start to sound like a charlatan up here when you say that it can cure or improve X, Y, Z. I mean, next thing we'll be talking about, it cures the common cold, and I think it probably at least helps mitigate the symptoms. This is powerful stuff. But I want to talk a little bit on the performance side of things, because that's what I was asked to focus on. So again, historically, athletes have been told to carb load, to get as much carbs before, during, and after exercise as they can tolerate. And that's still the recommendations today, as you can see here from some of the top professional organizations that deal with sports nutrition. And yet that paradigm is rapidly changing. It's much like the general dietary recommendations. It's kind of a slow turn here, but more and more we're seeing athletes not just performing, but really thriving on a ketogenic diet. So let's just look at metabolism here. When you ask the question, how do humans store fuel? It's pretty interesting that we did not evolve to store a lot of carbohydrate in our body. We can only jam about 500 grams of carbohydrate or glucose in our body. And most of that's in glycogen. The 99% of it's in glycogen. We have a little bit of blood sugar, but that's about a teaspoon in most people. So most of it's in skeletal muscle or the liver. Compared to how much fat we can store. I mean, we can store almost infinite amounts of fat in adipose tissue. But even the leanest athlete has an order of magnitude more fat than they do carbs. And it's being able to tap into that as a fuel source. That's one of the major advantages of a ketogenic diet. You know, you've all heard about athletes that hit the wall or bomb. Has anybody experienced that? It's pretty unpleasant, right? It's very memorable. I mean, it's something that just goes to our core because it's so profound. And what it really is, though, is it's an energy crisis in your brain. It's an interruption in glucose supply to the brain, and the brain controls all our movements, and it shuts down performance, and that's why you see such dramatic evidence of fatigue. And you also get these intrusive thoughts of carbohydrate because the body's seeking out a source of glucose. Now think about it for a minute, though. If it's an energy crisis in the brain, why does that happen when we have, in many people, 100,000 kilocalories worth of fuel on board? I mean, it's a little bit ironic, right? You've got all that energy, you just can't use it. And one of my friends used the analogy, it's like a gas tanker running out of gas on the highway. You've got a lot of fuel, it's just not accessible and usable in the way you need to use it. So that's one of the real advantages of a ketogenic diet for athletes, is they can now access that fat fuel tank much more efficiently. And it is an efficient source of energy. Fat is over twice the energy per unit weight, 9 versus 4 kcals per gram, and you can access it very quickly. So there's our fuel tanks. Now, part of the problem with consuming carbohydrate at all is that it blocks fat oxidation, and it is a very profound effect. So this is a graph of insulin versus fat breakdown. And you see it's not a straight line. It's a curvilinear exponential function here. And the point is that when insulin's moderately elevated, such as might occur after you drink a sugar-based sports drink or Gatorade or Powerade, versus having nothing or water or even a keto OS that's not going to spike your insulin. That difference in insulin has a huge impact on the amount of fat you can break down. So this is why eating carbs, it forces your body to oxidize carbs and simultaneously blocks your ability to burn fat. So this is part of the problem of the typical sports drinks that are promoted for athletes is they do provide energy in the form of glucose. And as long as you keep taking them, I guess it's okay. But that's not, without long-term implications, especially for athletes that may be somewhat insulin resistant. And it's blocking their ability to burn fat, which again I think is in general a bad thing. Going back to our diagram, that enhancing a cell's ability to burn fat is a good thing. And this is just sort of the other thing that occurs when you eat any type of high-carb, sugar-based meal. You get a rise in blood sugar, and of course following that, the pancreas pumps out a lot of insulin to be able to drive that blood sugar back into cells. And usually it overshoots. It's not a very good regulatory system to have to rely on because you've got these big excursions in blood sugar. So on a lot of people you get that rebound low blood sugar, and of course that's associated with fatigue and lethargy, and it elicits a stress response, a counter-regulatory hormone response that includes increases in cortisol and epinephrine, and that drives hunger responses and so forth. So you get into this vicious cycle with this roller coaster type response. And the spike too, there's nothing you really feel with the spike per se, but in a sort of stealth-like way, it's blocking your fat burning too because of the insulin response. And there's also a lot of athletes experiencing a lot of GI distress. It's very common, and it's exacerbated by all the sugar that they're consuming. So keto adaptation metabolically is switching over to burning fat and ketones. And part of that process is, over time, the muscle actually prefers the fatty acids and even some of the triglyceride that's circulating in the blood. And it spares the vast majority of ketones for the brain. Because again, the brain's burning 100, or 600 kcals per day, and the brain is the preferred organ that's using the ketones. And so, if you look in the literature, there's very little work done on ketogenic diets. Part of this goes back to the original studies in the 60s that really proved that carbohydrate loading enhanced performance. And they did. They showed that athletes on high-carb diets maximized glycogen levels, and that was associated with improved performance relative to athletes that were on a low-carb diet. But the Achilles heel in those studies, and all subsequent studies really, was that they only allowed the athletes to consume the low-carb diet for anywhere from like 3 to a maximum of 7 days. So there wasn't enough adaptation period, so of course performance went down. But they closed the book on it for 4 decades. And no one's really challenged that high-carb paradigm until recently, with the one exception, my colleague Steve Phinney. And Steve Phinney's just been a true pioneer in the low-carb area. He was doing this work back in the late 70s and early 80s, and published some really fantastic articles on keto adaptation. But they stand alone. There's nothing else out there. And he got beaten down by the medical establishment, nutrition establishment. And I think he credits me with resurrecting him around the late 90s. And I'm so glad I did, because his wisdom in this area really exceeds anyone that I've ever talked with. But he published a great study, and this was published in 1983, on athletes who were keto adapted. So he had the goal to take a group of high-level cyclists that were on very high carb diets and take them down to less than 20 grams of carbs per day. And this was a metabolic ward study, so perfect compliance. He fed them for 4 weeks and measured their performance. And performance did go down the first week, but after 4 weeks of adaptation, there was no decrement in performance, and some of the athletes actually did see an improvement in time to exhaustion. The RER numbers there show you that in the keto adapted state, after 4 weeks, they had a dramatic shift in their fuel use, so that the RER of 0.72 means they were burning almost exclusively fat for fuel during the exercise, versus an RER, respiratory exchange ratio, of 0.83 is indicative of like a 50-50 mix of carbs and fat. So there was a profound change in the use of fuel in these athletes as a result of diet. Now, our group started to get interested in this. Well, I was interested in it for a long time, but funding was pretty hard to get. It still is very hard to get to do these types of studies. But we cobbled enough money together to do a resistance training study several years ago. So this was a 12-week training study where we had a group that was on a low-fat and a ketogenic diet, just diet, and then we had 2 other groups that did the same diets but trained for 12 weeks. This was a progressive resistance training program. And we showed the group that lost the most body fat and it had the greatest improvements in body composition was the combined ketogenic diet and resistance training group. And they also had a lot of metabolic benefit too in terms of health markers, cholesterol, lipoprotein metabolism. And some of the individual responses were quite striking. So in just 12 weeks, and I'm admittedly cherry picking here the best responders, but it does give you a sense of what's possible in 12 weeks. So these 4 guys all lost 20 to 30 pounds of fat in 12 weeks. And that's pretty good. But I think what's more impressive is when you look at the fact that these same guys all gained muscle during that same time period. So they were in a caloric deficit and lost body mass and a lot of body fat, but they actually were able to build muscle simultaneously. And so there's a sort of a repartitioning effect here when you combine weight training with ketogenic diet. And I don't think I'll get any argument from Jake and Dom that probably the 2 best things you can do are getting ketosis and weight training as far as promoting a healthy body and improve your chances of living longer. So that you're starting to see a few more people talk and write about this. And I'll just mention one in particular, Tim Noakes. If you don't know that name, Tim Noakes is one of the most prolific exercise scientists in the world. He's from South Africa, an MD, PhD. He wrote one of the most popular books on nutrition for athletes called The Law of Running. And the vast majority of his career, he promoted high-carb diets, including that book, The Law of Running. He's quite an accomplished endurance athlete himself, having run comrades many times. And despite all his research and knowledge and own physical training that he was doing, developed type 2 diabetes. Wow. He has a strong family history and couldn't outrun it. So he tried a low-carb diet probably about 3 years ago now and had a transformative result. Diabetes went away, and being such a gracious human being and courageous human being, and what I would call an almost unprecedented way, admitted that he was wrong his entire career, apologized to all the people that he had written all these papers and books that have read his material and has now been, really championing the low-carb ketogenic approach, primarily in South Africa, but his reach is worldwide. And so he's just a real strong voice now, an advocate for ketogenic diets. They're also very big in Australia. I know I have some colleagues there that have written a book called What the Fat, and they've also just come out with the recipe book as well, but this book is focused on performance, and it's quite well done. And it's also big in a lot of the Scandinavian countries. So they're actually further ahead than we are in the US in sort of embracing the ketogenic approach for performance. But I took a lab group up to the Western States Endurance Run in 2012. This is a 100-mile trail run through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Just ridiculous why people would do this. They come out in droves to do this. They only allow about 300-400 athletes to run this race every year, and it's brutal. So I was standing at the finish line here with some of my research team, and this is Tim Olson crossing the finish line in what was a record that year by, I think, over 30 minutes. And you probably can't see the numbers there, but he finished the race in 14 hours, 46 minutes. Phenomenal feat of performance. And he's a well-known low-carb athlete that has recently switched to low-carb, and obviously it's working for him. He came back the following year and also won, slightly slower time, but it was also one of the hottest years ever at that race. And there are a whole bunch of these ultra endurance runners that are embracing low carb. I think this is probably the community, the one group of athletes that have embraced low carb the most. And probably for obvious reasons. I mean, when you're running for many, many hours like they do, you inevitably run out of carbs, and it's very difficult to keep fueling with carbs. And so they experience just transformative results when they switch over to burning fat. This is Zach Bitter, awesome person, school teacher from Wisconsin, who has just been tearing it up since he switched to low carb, probably about 5 years ago now. He currently holds the 100-mile track record. So yes, he ran around the track. Do the math. How many times? I think they reversed it just to add a little variety. But he set that record about 2 years ago, and recently just rebroke his record. So he ran that in under 12 hours. So again, do the math on the pace there. This is incredible that he's able to do this, perform at that level in a keto-adapted state. This is John Rutherford. He's somebody we've studied in the lab. He's a real F-18 pilot. I mean, he is the real Top Gun. And that's his plane too. It says Captain John Rutherford. So he's probably one of the most serious low-carb athletes that I know. John's going to get a little upset with that. And quite an accomplished athlete too, a big ultra runner, and it's also, I know, has experimented with various ketone supplements and has helped his performance, the combination of the diet with the supplements. He also, once you get to know him, he opens up a bit and was telling some pretty amazing stories about ejecting out of an F-18. I think he set the record, and they had to rewrite the manuals on how low you could eject from one, and destroyed the plane too. Whatever, probably $10 million plane in the process.
Why?
Mike Morton might be regarded as the greatest ultra endurance runner of all time. He's also a military soldier, special ops, but was quite an accomplished endurance runner in his 20s. Kind of fell off the grid for a decade or so, but came back in his late 30s. He's in his early 40s now, and just started setting records as a low-carb athlete. And that included, in one case, he ran 100-mile races on back-to-back weekends and won both. He set a record in one of them. He also holds the 24-hour distance record. Ran 172 plus miles in 24 hours. So this is another incredible human that has, responded favorably, very favorably to a ketogenic diet. And it's not just individual ultra runners. It's now creeping into team sports. So soccer is probably the one team sport where it's caught pretty significant traction. So the All Blacks, they're a rugby team from New Zealand that won the championship last year. So as I was saying, it's pretty big in Australia, New Zealand. It's almost the norm there, I think, for what I've heard from folks. But even in my own backyard, I found out the Columbus Crew, their professional soccer team, they made it to the championship last year. They've been doing low carb for a couple years, and I've been working pretty close with their high performance director, and they're trying to take it to the next level. And then it extends into basketball. There were rumors the LA Lakers were going low carb. Two of our top downhill skiers, Lindsey Vonn, Bodie Miller, have both written about the benefits of going low carb. As mentioned earlier, LeBron James lost some weight in the off season. I doubt he's doing low carb in season, but clearly there's application here into all sorts of different sports and athletic endeavors. So what are some of the reasons why a ketogenic diet would benefit athletes? We kind of talked about the metabolic benefits of being able to burn fat more efficiently and have that access to a much greater fuel tank is a huge advantage, especially with the ultra endurance athletes that are exercising for several hours. When you're burning fat and sparing carbohydrate and glycogen, you're generating less hydrogen ion, and that creates less acid stress on the body. So that's a potential mechanism that would improve your tolerance to fatigue. Some of it's more indirect. Athletes benefit from being leaner, so it's much easier to lose weight, and in particular lose body fat while maintaining lean tissue and improving your power to weight ratio. So that's really important for most athletes, where being leaner without losing muscle is beneficial. We talked about the use of ketones in the brain. Well, what most of these athletes talk about in the endurance world is they become bomb-proof. So they can't hit the wall. And this is one of the known metabolic effects of ketones, is they allow a really profound protection from low blood sugar. And Cahill did these experiments back in the 60s where they actually drove blood sugar down in people who were starved to levels that were below 20 milligrams per deciliter by infusing insulin into these folks. And these people, that would put most people into a coma. And yet these people had no signs or symptoms of low blood sugar. So these athletes are experiencing the same type of protection from low blood sugar when they're keto adapted, and therefore they're able to exercise for many, many hours without hitting the wall. And then there's these signaling effects that I talked about with ketones. Exercise causes a lot of inflammation and oxidative stress that if you don't recover from, you will maladapt. And so having an ability to recover faster is a huge benefit of being keto adapted, I think. And it's probably mediated through less inflammation, less oxidative stress, and a better ability to adapt to the exercise stimulus. And there's just, you just augment a lot of the health benefits of exercise. One benefit of exercise is it improves insulin sensitivity in muscle. And I won't go into the mechanisms, but that's a well-known process that occurs. But one way to counteract it is to eat carbs after exercise. And that's been shown in studies. And also you can decrease the mitochondrial biogenesis that occurs as a result of exercise if you eat carbs after exercise. So what do we tell people to do after exercise?
Eat carbs.
Eat carbs. It's just insanity. And for a lot of people in particular, not elite athletes, but just the average person that's mustering up every ounce of energy they have just to walk for 30 minutes on a treadmill, and then they feel compelled to have a Gatorade afterward because they think it's doing the body good, and they probably canceled out the vast majority of benefit that they would have received from that exercise. So there's a lot of people that fall into that category that would do so much better to be in ketosis and then to get more benefit from the exercise they're doing. So I'm going to conclude and talk to you about a study that we just finished right before I left the University of Connecticut and moved to Ohio State. We wanted to understand these ultra-endurance athletes who were on ketogenic diets a little better because they'd never been studied before. And they, outside of that one study that Finney published in the 80s, which was a really small study, but it was really remarkable and never been validated in 30 plus years. So we designed this study called FASTER, and we published the first paper a few months ago in Metabolism. Our goal here was just to convince these guys to come to our lab, because we had all the equipment in our lab. We couldn't go to them. I mean, we did go to Western States, but we can't do much in the field. We do some simple things. So the first thing that I was shocked by was these athletes were more than happy to come to our lab without really being paid much money, and to go through what I'll describe in a minute were some pretty invasive procedures. I thought we'd have to beg and plead to get them to come, but it was just the opposite. So just a remarkable group we recruited. It was 20 athletes in total. 10 of the athletes were following your traditional high-carb diet. The other 10 were the pioneers that had switched to a very low-carb diet. And it was really important for us to match them because we didn't want them to be different in any other way. And we did a really excellent job at that. So they're same age, same basic status. They were all really elite ultra runners, finishing in the top 10% of the pack. Many of them actually record holders and Olympic level athletes. So these were not your garden variety ultra runners. But even had the same VO2 max. So they're really well matched. The only difference was their diet, and it was dramatically different. So the high carb guys are eating over half their energy from carbs, which is typical. But the low carb athletes were less than 10% of their calories, or around 10% from carbs. And we took them through a battery of tests. We only had them for two and a half days, so we got as much as we could out of them. The main test was a 3-hour run on a treadmill, where they basically stared at a blank white wall for 3 hours.
Oh my gosh.
You'd think it's torturous, but for these guys, like 3 hours is like a warm-up. So they're pretty incredible. And then we wanted to get as much information as possible, so we were collecting tissue samples, muscle biopsies, we were collecting stool samples, urine, saliva, cheek cells. We even wanted fat cells, and most of these guys didn't have much fat, so we turned them over on their bellies and we stuck a needle in the upper part of their buttocks and aspirated out fat cells so we could get it. And again, I was like, these guys are, we're going to have them sign something that they'll never tell anybody what we did to them. Honest to God, they left smiling and so happy to participate in our research. They were just the most gracious participants I've ever worked with. So this is not from the study, but I wanted to give you a little context here before I show some of the results. This was a study that asked the question, what's the maximum amount of fat a human can burn? And it's legitimately the largest study that has ever addressed this question. And what you can see is that of these 300 plus people they studied, which included some elite athletes, the highest rate of fat burning in any given person is about 1 gram per minute. So 1 gram of fat burned or oxidized per minute, or 60 grams per hour. And you'd be hard-pressed to find any paper in the literature that would report a value higher than that. And most people fall well below that. So just keep that number in mind. So this is the results from our FASTER group. So the high-carb guys, there's the 10 values there. The mean was about almost 0.7 grams per minute. And that's pretty high. I mean, these guys are good fat burners. They're elite athletes. They have to be good fat burners. but they're eating carbs, so they're probably haven't maximized their fat burning, right? And there's that 1 gram per minute, which is really regarded as the ceiling as far as what humans can achieve. And here's the fat burning from our keto adapted. So they are literally 2-fold higher rates of fat oxidation. The lowest fat burner is well above the highest fat burner in the high carb group. And when you look at fat oxidation as a measure of their fat oxidation, and you see the blue line there, that's typical what you see in the textbooks. You know, you as you go from low to moderate intensity exercise, you increase fat burning. But the absolute rate of fat burning drops off dramatically as you increase exercise intensity. But you see that curve is dramatically higher and pushed to the right in the keto adapted athletes. So that means they can burn more fat at any exercise intensity, but they can also burn fat at higher exercise intensities. And if you look at the fuel use during the 3-hour treadmill run, so we locked the intensity down here. This was sub-maximal at 64% VO2 max. So they're both running at the same relative intensity. But the high carb guys burn a mix of carbs and fat, which is what you'd expect. And they tend to burn a little less carbs over time and more fat as glycogen becomes depleted. But the low carb guys, they just cruise along burning almost all fat the entire 3 hours.
Wow.
So almost 90% of their fuel use is coming from fat. And these guys are burning like 700-800 kcals per hour. And just to show you a few of the blood markers, we've done a lot of work in this study that I won't go through all the data, but just to show you they were in ketosis. They did get the post-exercise ketosis that is quite common after endurance exercise. We see about a 2-fold increase in ketones. And then this is serum glycerol. This is basically a biomarker of fat breakdown, or lipolysis. So as you might expect, the keto-adapted athletes are breaking down fat more rapidly and then using that fat. So as you can see here, glycerol is almost 2-fold higher, and it goes up dramatically during exercise. So they're more efficient at breaking down and burning fat than the high-carb athletes. Now, what was most shocking so far in this study that we uncovered is the glycogen results. So, quite to my surprise, and pretty much everyone I've talked to, is that the glycogen values were exactly the same between the two groups. So, not only did they start at the same glycogen levels at the beginning of exercise, after 3 hours of running, they both showed the same depletion. And then during 2 hours of recovery, they showed the same rate of resynthesis. And you can see the individual data is pretty tight. And that resynthesis of glycogen occurred despite the fact we didn't give them carbs. They had a few grams of carbs. We gave them a high-fat shake. And the high-carb group, we did give a high-carb shake. So the low-carb guys were at a significant disadvantage, and yet they still synthesized glycogen. So, you know, there's some reasons why this may have happened that we're speculating, but the main point here is that in a keto-adapted athlete, there are some really unexpected changes that occur in glycogen metabolism. And that really result in maintenance of glycogen during the keto-adapted state. Now, I will say these guys were all very well adapted. By that I mean they've been on this diet for, in many cases, more than a couple years. I think the average is about 20 months. So this may be a long-term adaptation. We don't know for sure because we didn't study it in a temporal way. But I suspect this may take several months or even years to happen. And I will note there was some hint that this could happen if you look in the literature. There's been some studies on Alaskan sled dogs. In particular, dogs that compete in the Iditarod race, which happens to be going on now, or I think it might be just finishing now. But these dogs are amazing athletes. They run 1,000 miles from Anchorage to Nome, and they have VO2 maxes 2 times what humans do. And they thrive on a high-fat ketogenic diet, actually. But there have been studies that have shown when these dogs even though they may run, 50, 100 miles a day, and they eat a relatively low-carb, high-fat diet, they maintain their glycogen levels as well. So there's some data there in different species that this is possible, but it's certainly not what you'd expect based on our knowledge of glycogen and the need to consume carbs to maintain glycogen. What was interesting is the high-carb participants were very curious about the ketogenic diet. Pretty small community, I guess, where they know what's going on, and they know there's a huge movement in that community. And we've stayed in touch with several of these athletes, and here are two in particular athletes that were high-carb when we studied them, but when the study was done, they switched to a ketogenic diet. And I won't read through that now, but both these athletes had very positive experiences to a ketogenic diet. So 2 out of 10, that's 20% conversion. I think there's another one in there too. So this is a movement that's happening now. I don't think it's a fad either. Like, this is something that, nobody's holding a gun to these athletes' heads saying you have to eat ketogenic diet. They're doing it because there's a perceived benefit to it from their perspective. And beyond, just sports and athletes, I think it's great we can enhance somebody's triathlon time and so forth. But what I'm really interested in on the performance side of things is how we can help our soldiers. And not just physically. I think there's a huge... You heard it mentioned before, brought up in the Q&A, that a lot of our soldiers are suffering from post-traumatic stress. I do think there's a role of ketosis. It hasn't been well studied, as was pointed out. There's a lot of anecdotal testimonials out there that suggest it's having a positive effect on that. But even just in the active special ops community, where these guys and some gals are experiencing multiple stressors, physical, psychological, environmental stress, being in a state of ketosis makes them much more resilient and able to deal with those stress and perform physically and cognitively and make better tactical decisions. So that's one area we're very focused on. We have some ongoing studies that are trying to address certain aspects of this. And as Dom mentioned, the DARPA, that's the Advanced Funding Agency in the military that gave us the internet and other crazy things, right? They've dabbled in this, and they're the ones that invested in the ketone ester, and so they're interested in ketosis. We're trying to get them more interested in ketosis and all its various possibilities to augment soldier health and performance. So that's one major area that we're pursuing in my lab. But the thing to realize is, unlike a drug that, this is my last slide, that has a single target, that's relatively easy to understand, ketogenic diets are really complex. They're not working through one single mechanism, and this is hard for a lot of scientists to deal with because scientists are mostly reductionists. They just tend to think, in very myopic ways in which something might work. A ketogenic diet, is a very robust stimulus that is working through a lot of different mechanisms, both as a metabolite and as a signaling molecule. But in the end, we know that it's associated with a lot of benefits, from performance to better metabolic health, improving diabetes and neurological conditions, and probably helping us live longer, or if not longer, at least compress morbidity and live healthier. So there's a lot to sort out here if you're a scientist studying this, and that, you can kind of view that as embrace it and view it positively, or a lot of people avoid it because it is so complex to work out mechanisms. But it's a fantastic tool, and you guys all know that, so I'm speaking to the choir. But as a scientist, this is really emerging. There's a lot of interest in this area. It's just tremendous. We have people like Dominic and Jake and Angela who are really pushing the envelope now into new areas because this is still heretical when you talk to typical, I mean, just ask Dom, I think he was pretty anxious the last year whether or not he was going to be promoted. And that's not trivial. There's a lot of people, a lot of staunch defenders of the status quo that don't want to see this stuff promoted. And that's what we're up against. And we're also up against some pretty powerful forces just with our political system, our economic system. A lot of our economy is based around carbohydrate-based foods. And so this is more than just the science. This is about how do we apply the science and change the paradigm. And the stakes are high, though. We're talking about people's health. And that's why I think we need to, it's worth the fight. So thank you, appreciate
And I think the Prover Nation out here is making efforts at what you just said there, because I agree, we're up against a lot of things. And researchers all know it. It's obstacles. But I think one major way that we maybe do that is one household at a time. Every time we get in the house and we actually have that conversation with the everyday people that are now having questions about, like, hey, what do I say to my doctor? And Don, that was a perfect answer, by the way. And I think that you can bring education to them, so that they can go back and look at your research or look at your research and become more educated on this. So you're playing a huge role in this because of what they're trying to do, but we can get more eyes on the power of what they're talking about. That movement can happen. So got 3 questions. All right.
Hey, my name is Dawn Allen from Lakeland, Florida, and the question that I have is in regards to women with their ups and downs of their hormonal issues and weight loss. So from a keto-adapted state, how could that improve or play a role in that fat loss and balance?
Excellent question. I wish I had an equally excellent answer. But in general, we don't see big differences in weight loss, relative weight loss, and improvements in metabolic syndrome with men and women. You're in it for the long term, so I think there may be some fluctuations over the course of the cycle, but when you're talking about losing 30, 40 pounds and reversing diabetes, that's happening over several months, and so there's not a big difference here between men and women. There is differences between people, though, in what level of carbs they need to get into ketosis and what level they may need to sustain to keep it in remission. But I don't see big gender differences in this that override those individual differences that just are a result of our genetic heterogeneity we have as humans.
So would you say that just it's time and maybe dialing in the diet, finding the appropriate diet for those individuals?
Yes, that's a great follow-up, because I probably didn't make this quite explicit, but everyone has to find their own path. I mean, there's not one cookie-cutter approach that works for everybody, even when it comes to a ketogenic diet. Not everyone necessarily needs to have the carbs low enough, especially now that we can augment it with keto OS and other exogenous forms of ketones. This opens up a whole new area that we have very little knowledge on from a scientific perspective. But now, there's different ways to create the diet and combine it with the exogenous ketones. But everybody's got to find what works for them. And we need to support people with their experimenting and dialing it in. That's what's not happening now. This isn't even offered as a treatment for obesity and diabetes in most places that are offering these types of programs. If you go to your physician, if he recommends a ketogenic diet, you have a very progressive physician. They're out there, but they're far and few between.
Over here. My name's Tom Jones from New Jersey. From what I'm gathering, the research certainly suggests that athletes who haven't experienced optimal ketosis either haven't tried it at all or haven't given it long enough of an opportunity to adapt. Are there certain types of people, either a certain demographic group or a certain pre-existing condition, or certain physical endeavor, certain sports, where a ketogenic diet is not optimal? Or would you say at this point the research indicates that unequivocally you can confidently state that everyone ought to be doing it?
I don't think everyone, needs to do it in terms of the athletes. I think it's starting to become apparent if you're an ultra endurance runner that doing some type of carb restriction is probably better than focusing on high carb. But outside of that, we just don't have enough data. And now that we can combine the low carb diet with exogenous ketones, I think it starts to open up, a more logical reason why it might enhance higher intensity performance too. Because there's very little work done in that area. I know, Jake's team is really doing some great work with resistance training and showing better adaptations in some cases. But beyond that, there's very little work out there. And it may be that some combination of ketones plus maybe some carbs for these athletes strategically timed is ideal. We don't know. I don't think we need all the sugar though. I'm pretty confident we can say that athletes should be moving away from all the sugar-based gels and drinks that are out there and moving toward something like a keto OS, or if you're going to eat carbs, make it something that's slower absorbing and not punishing your pancreas every time you ingest these sugars. So there's definitely ways to improve the high carb approach too that needs to be considered. But this is why nutrition is so complex. There's no one size fits all. We all have to kind of find our own path, and ketosis is a path that's been completely ignored. And the reality is that it should probably be a default for some athletes. Where I would say you could start to be more definitive and say it might be the way to go is for athletes who have a high level of insulin resistance, because they are the ones that don't respond well to high carbs, even if they're athletes. Like Tim Noakes couldn't outrun his diabetes. So a lot of that's genetic. We are born with different levels of insulin resistance, and in some ways exercise can maybe delay you developing prediabetes and diabetes, but you'd be much better off restricting carbs if you fall into that category of being insulin resistant.
Number 3.
Hi, Doctor. Lee, Yuka, Beatrice, Lisa, John from Naples, Florida. Thank you so much for all the work you've done and watching your videos for the last 2 weeks and getting a ton of knowledge. Me personally, I've dropped about 35 pounds in the last 2.5 months. Before that, I was Ironman, double iron, triple iron, crazy endurance athlete. John and I, we've been following the plan for about the last 2.5, 3 months, and we are both going to be doing a half marathon, end of April, beginning of May. So when I was running marathons in the glycogen world, it was always the 2,000 calorie mark. That's when you started bonking, and that's when you needed the sugar, and that's when you went station to station to your buffet table of sugar and carbohydrates. What would you tell somebody who is practicing the ketogenic diet to do before the race, the night before, as opposed to loading up on a plate of pasta? And then what would somebody do during a race, like a half or a full?
Yeah, most of these athletes that are keto adapted don't even bother with in-race nutrition until they get out to like 3-4 hours, because they can easily get through that duration of exercise without having any in-race calories. So that's one of the big advantages. They don't have to eat as much during exercise. And then, everything's just easier. You don't worry and obsess about your pre and post-exercise meals when you're keto adapted, because your body's always well fed, your brain's well fed on ketones. And I think every keto adapted athlete I've talked to, that comes out as one of the most consistent benefits they talk about is they don't need to obsess about eating carbs like they used to. Because usually, when you get done with your training or a competition, you just start jamming down bagels and bananas and as much carbs as you can. A lot of these guys will go out for 2-3 hour runs in the morning and fasted, or maybe they'll have their bulletproof coffee in the morning, and then they come back and they're not ravagingly hungry. They may, get cleaned up and not eat for several hours. I mean, it's just astonishing that, there's just tremendous satiety that's associated with ketosis, and all this, post-exercise nutrition becomes less important to them. And it hasn't been well studied to know what we should be recommending if you need certain, amino acids or proteins, and how fat would even impact. But the ones that are out there doing the ultra running, they usually do something in race, when you're doing the 50, 100-mile races. And it really varies from athlete to athlete. Some do trickle in some carbs, but very low amounts. Some concoct their own, higher fat products with coconut oil and nuts and seeds and butters and things. But it really is, I get a lot of different variety from athletes. They all kind of figure out what works best for them.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Volek. Give everybody